along with me, one of the few people that remembers anything that happened before 1964.
I'm not sure that's a compliment or
No,
not.
it's not a compliment, but it's me too. Because most of the people I talked to, the world began then, except for the big bands. What was the state of English music before all this started? I mean, you were here and working. But...
It was very, very funny, actually. In the 1960s, it was very primitive by today's standards, of course. It was rock and roll was had hardly made any effect in this country. I mean, we had Elvis Presley, but most people considered him to be something of a freak, except the hardcore enthusiasts. He obviously became very important, and there became a rash of imitators. This is in the late 1950s. And in fact, at that time, I was a comedy producer. I was running Parlophone Records. I was the youngest owner of a label, if you can call it an owner, because I didn't own anything. But I mean, I ran the Parlophone label as a small empire, and I produced everything that went on it. And I produced jazz and orchestral records and what went for pop in those days, which was generally a band singer with an orchestral accompaniment. Fairly liquid stuff. And I had to make my label do something different. And it was such a tiny label. We were overweighted by the big fellows, HMV and Columbia, who had all your American catalogues. And when the new era of rock and roll came in, then Elvis Presley went on HMV, and HMV were important. And all the old pre-Presley stuff like Guy Mitchell and Frankie Lane and Doris Day and all those kind of people, Rosemary Clooney, they were all CBS, and they came on to Columbia Records in England. Poor little Parlophone hadn't anything except a few jazz people.
Was this part of EMI?
It was part of EMI, but it
was Columbia and was
right.
Everything.
But Parlophone was the poor relation, and they had a poor relation running it too.
How did you get there?
Well, I joined Parlophone originally in 1950. When I came out of music college, and I did it really I was playing the oboe in an orchestra in the evenings, and I just did it as a stopgap to earn a bit more money. And because I'd been trained classically, the guy who was running Parlophone at the time, he wanted an assistant who was a musician. He offered me the job and put me in charge of the classical end of Parlophone. So I did all the Baroque recordings. There was an ensemble called the London Baroque Ensemble, and I was put in charge of that, and I produced a lot of records with Dietersdorf and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, all that stuff, and woodwind stuff, which I knew about because I was a woodwind player. And some of those recordings I still look back on with a great deal of affection because they weren't bad. But after 5 years of working as a kind of apprentice to the boss, Oscar Preuss, he gradually made me do more and more things. And he introduced me to producing for jazz musicians we had on our label, like Humphrey Lyttelton and Johnny Dankworth, and Jack Parnell and Joe Daniels and so on, English jazz, and orchestral records and so on. And gradually he got me doing all his job. So that after about 4 years I was pretty competent. And after 5 years, he reached the age of 65 and he'd retired. Well, they made him retire. He was given a set of Encyclopaedia Britannica, and God bless you, and off he went. And I thought, well, now what's going to happen to poor little Parlophone? And to my surprise, they offered me the job, and they made me head of Parlophone. And I was flabbergasted. I was 29. And they said, you've got to make this into a label that works, because it hadn't done up to that time. So I turned to comedy. And I thought, well, nobody else is doing comedy in this world, and I always had a funny sense of humour. So I started rooting around, mixing with some friends I knew. And I struck up a friendship with a couple of young radio performers who were creating a little bit of noise, but not much, called Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers. And they just started a radio series called The Goon Show. So I started recording them. And I made records with both of them. And Peter was just about to start his film career. And I suggested I made an album, because LPs, long-playing records, just about in that time. And everybody thought I was crazy. Oh, before I did that, I made a record with Peter Ustinov.
Comedy album? A
comedy record with Peter Ustinov, which my bosses had so little confidence in, they ordered 500 to be pressed, and that was it. And those 500 were sold out on the first day. And nothing gave me more pleasure than to go back and say, you've made a cock-up, and it was quite a big seller. And, of course, the Peter Sellers albums were very big sellers. in this country.
Even though he was on the radio.
Yeah, because he was just blossoming. Oh, the Goon shows became incredibly popular. And even though he was on the radio, Peter was beginning to be a film star. And the first album I made with him was called, I arrogantly titled it The Best of Sellers. And it was, in fact. But again, my bosses didn't believe in it. And they said, well, this kind of stuff won't sell, you know. So we'll let you make a 10-inch LP, not a 12-inch. Which I thought was stupid. Of course, in later years, they had to revamp it and issue it as a 12-inch. And so I made 3 albums with him. And then I went on to people like Michael Flanders and Donald Swan. I secured the rights to the shirt, the top of a hat. I secured the rights to the Beyond the Fringe with Jonathan Miller and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. And a lot of English comedy actors like Bernard Cribbins and Charlie Drake and Rolf Harris. And I became known as the comics producer. And Parlophone Records sold. And we got into the charts. And even I actually had a number 2 best-selling record with a guy by the name of Jim Dale, who was, in fact, originally a comic.
The actor?
The actor, he's now an actor, and a very established actor, too.
It sounds like, and for the people I met who were prominent, Sir Edward Lewis and Sir Joseph Lockwood, that the people who ran the record companies might just as well have been running an automobile manufacturer.
Oh, absolutely.
The executive ranks of record companies were
they were
removed, weren't
they were incredible. I mean, the English record business in those days was very much it was sort of, it had a class structure. And I mean, I was very aware of this because although I was so hyped, I was so excited by my job because it was enormously creative. It was desperately badly paid. And it was a different class structure from either the salespeople or the directors. And if you were in charge of a label, producing, my title was Artist and Repertoire Manager. And we call them different things nowadays. Artist and Repertoire is a department, but an A&R man is now accepted, but it was a different thing in those days. And I didn't even have a company car. You know, I just had to buy my own little Mini and drive around it. We were the underdogs of the outfit. And I remember a director coming from Hayes on a visit around the studios because he wanted to see what happened in the studios rather than interested. He'd never been around there. A fellow who's deciding upon the future of EMI market. And he'd never been there. And he stopped in the control room. He was quite fascinated. He said, now tell me, Martin, he said, I've looked at some of the statistics for last year. And you're obviously doing quite a good job, but I see that there were something like 200 singles, and only 27 of those entered the top 10. Why did you make the others? Why didn't you just concentrate on those 27? Why did you bother with all the other 183? And I couldn't believe he was serious. He really meant it. He really could think it was like producing a bicycle, you know. Why don't you cut out all the ones that don't sell and just concentrate on the ones that do? He had no conception at all about business. And I'm afraid EMI has always had that kind of problem.
And you so you fought your way through that, and here you are with Parlophone Records in the 60s.
Right.
And it's now
Jim Dale was my biggest star.
this very musical personality was making all his money making comedy records.
Well, I was always a kind of thorn in EMI's side, if you'll figure of the pun, because I was always saying, you know, our studios aren't good enough, they should be better. Why don't we get like the Americans? The Americans can show us how. And I did have a minor hit with a guy called Ron Goodwin in America called Swinging Sweethearts, an orchestral record. And the EMI blokes offered to send me to America to have a look at the scene as a result of this, because Ron was needed over there. And so I went over and I saw Capitol that had just been recently acquired. And the Capitol people were very kind to me. This was in the days of Alan Livingston. I was invited to go to a number of recording sessions, one of which was Frank Sinatra's Come Fly With Me, which was done in, I forget which studio, in Capitol Tower it was, but it was. I think it was Val Valentino was engineering, is that right? Mm-hmm. Was he an engineer in those days? Right. Boyle Gilmore was producing. Lauren Bacall was the girlfriend. Sinatra was there, singing live, of course. And Billy May was the conductor and arranger. And they started at 7 in the evening and finished at 11. And they cut 5 titles in that time on 3-track half-inch. And I was overwhelmed. I thought it was fantastic. Billy May's arrangements were superb. The engineering was superb. Boyle just sat and sort of kind of managed things very comfortably without any... Sinatra just sang beautifully, and almost invariably, it was the first take, was the master. And if he was happy with his performance, he didn't even want to know about anybody else's. He accepted that they did their job. He was ultra professional. And I thought, what a wonderful, this is so much better than anything we can do in England. The technical side of it, the microphones, the boards and everything was so much better. And I was enormously impressed until the very end of the evening when Voyle Gilmore showed him the sleeve he was going to put on the album. And Frank did his nut and tore him off such a strip it wasn't true. I couldn't understand what it was about until I saw the album cover. And on it was a painting, it was a drawing of Frank Sinatra with his, and you remember the famous one. But of course on the back of it, it's a Come Fly With Me, and there's a big TWA aircraft. And Frank immediately put two and two together and said, you've got a break-off from TWA out of this, which he had. And it was a big row. But of course it still stayed on, and after that Frank left and went to reprise, didn't it?
So you came back now.
I went back to England, enthused with America, and saying, we've got to do something about our studios, because our studios are dreadful. I've always said this, now we've got to do something about it. And EMI moved very, very slowly. And it wasn't until I got any power at all that I was able to do something about it, because in the 1960s I was looking for something that would give me a solid success, because every comedy record was a one-off. Every time you made a comedy record, you had to find a new script or a new idea or a new song that would make you that hit. You didn't have any continuation at all. There was no built-in success. And my friend across the road in Columbia, Norrie Paramore, had a young guy called Cliff Richard, who'd just come along the scene. And he seemed to be, everything he did turned to gold. I thought, well, if I had somebody like that, it'd be great. And so I was looking for something. Until one day, Brian Epstein walked into my office with a disc of this group that he had in Liverpool, which was an awful sound, dreadful, really. And I couldn't quite understand why Dick Rowe turned it down. And if I'd known then that everybody else in the record business had also turned it down, I might not have accepted it. But I didn't do a handstand and say, this is the next coming, you know. I said, okay, they're interesting. I'd like to meet the guys, bring them to London, and I'll spend an afternoon in the studio with them, and we'll see what we can do. And so he went back and brought the boys back to London yet again. They'd already done this. I didn't know this. And I spent the afternoon in Abbey Road with them and fell in love with them. And they were the Beatles, and signed them immediately.
I just want to get back and talk about that, but along with the Beatles, all of a sudden came this rush of British acts that...
Well, that happened after the Beatles.
Happened after the Beatles, but not too long.
No, because it was a gold mine. It was Klondike.
It was all of a sudden other things happened. Why, had the Beatles not come along, would there have been a difficult of British acts worldwide? Would the others have?
It's difficult to say because they were the trigger. There was no question about it. Difficult to say what would happen if they hadn't never existed. But certainly, the success we had with them was so great in England. It was hard work. I mean, nobody in the very first record I made with them was "Love Me Do," and nobody wanted to hear it, particularly the people within AMI. They thought, when I announced at a meeting that I was issuing a new group with the name The Beatles, they all fell around laughing, particularly the way it was spelled, and said, it's another one of your comedy ones, isn't it? You know, is it a funny group you got? I said, no, it's not funny, it's rock and roll. You doing rock and roll, but you're a comedy producer. And that was what I had all the time. And the very first record, they didn't promote at all. I think they played it twice on their Radio Luxembourg programs. And that was it. And it got to number 17 in the charts, purely on Brian Epstein's efforts and buying about 2,000 records for his own stores and hyping it.
But would English music... what I'm trying to figure is, how come all of a sudden a country that had really given us nothing because Cliff Richards hadn't... I'm talking from the perspective of the United States.
Well, there was a groundswell.
Yeah.
There was a groundswell, undoubtedly. I mean, there was a kind of revolution going on, even outside our business, amongst young people. Mary Quant emerged at the same time. There was a kind of rebellion. It was symptomatic of something that happened, freedom of the dreariness of the war, I guess. A new generation of kids were growing up that weren't cluttered by our education that we'd had in the war. This was 1960, and they were baby booms. You know, they were kids that were born in the war that were now suddenly earning money and wanting something different, or born just after it during the period of austerity. And they were establishing their own freedom, I think, and they wanted to kick over the traces and have something of their own. And there seemed to be a spirit abroad where people wanted to do something for themselves. And the Beatles showed them how, and there was a whole rash of kids making a living, trying to forming groups and so on. It didn't start with the Beatles. It started with other people before then. It started with, Tommy Steele was way before the Beatles. And I had a skiffle group called the Vipers, which Tommy Steele had used an accompanying band, who were very good, but they were non-electric. But they were like a rock and roll band, but acoustic.
It's in talking to a number of musicians in this country, the impact of the American blues musicians was amazing. Muddy Waters, and
Yeah.
Wallace. Why was that? And they had very little currency in the United States. Kids were not listening.
Well, this is one of the reasons why Liverpool may have been the reason, the sort of origin for England of that kind of phenomenon, because it was a port that received all the stuff from America, and the seamen would go to America and they come back that way, and they bring back with them records. And I know that the Beatles used to be able to get records in Liverpool more easily than we could get in London. Obviously, London had a docks too. But nevertheless, there seemed to be much more of a channel of music coming from America, and it was the Negro influence that affected those Liverpool people so much. Maybe they had some kind of affinity, of some kind of oppression or whatever it is, depression.
And the amazing thing is they took this blues music, cycled it through their own rock and roll, and brought it back to the States.
That's right.
And because nobody was doing that in America, they wiped everybody out. They
Absolutely.
came back with American music, kind of.
We re-exported your music back to you.
Amazing thing.
And a lot of things that Paul and John did were dead copies of things they'd heard. The falsetto singing that Paul and shaking their heads was a takeoff from Little Richard. A lot of those things, and a lot of the records they heard, they would lift phrases from them.
Chuck Berry riffs.
Exactly. Oh yeah, Chuck. They'd listen to the records and they'd work out how to do it. And if George Harrison mastered a Chuck Berry riff, he would come home very proudly and say, and he'd use it ad nauseam.
What was the reaction, you, EMI, and the band itself, when all of a sudden this thing exploded? Did you have any conception how big it would be, how long it would last?
No, everybody thought it would be a flash in the pan. I was terribly excited because it was very creative with them. To begin with, they were very raw in the studio, and the music they churned out was pretty. The songs they wrote weren't very good. And you listen to those early records, they were very raw. But they learned incredibly quickly. And I saw, as soon as we had our first number one hit, which was Please Please Me, I knew that we needed an album very quickly. And I'd been up to the cabin, I listened to all the stuff they'd done, which was some of their songs, but mostly other people's songs, things like Roll Over Beethoven and Anna and Chains and so on. And I said, let's take all the stuff and come down to the studios and we'll do it in one day, which we did. Started at 10 in the morning, finished at 11 at night. That was the album, finished. And we got it out within 3 weeks. And that was the first album we made. We made it in one single day. And then, from then on, Brian Epstein and I worked together very closely, planning their future. And we agreed that we should put out a single every 3 months and an album every 6 months. That was the program, if we could keep it up. And if we couldn't, we'd make it later. But that was the general idea. And we stuck to it.
At what point did you have some sense that these were songs that would last, and these were records that would last?
I think really after about the third single, after about, let me see, Please Please Me from Me to You, She Loves You, I think was a kind of turning point. And of course, I Want to Hold Your Hand was the one that broke in the States. But the great saga that we had in trying to get them out in the States.
We had 2 records that went on BJ.
And it was like St. Peter, we kept knocking on the door and being turned away.
Well, were you involved in all of that?
Very much so. I could see we were on a great rising surge of success here. And I was working my guts out making these records. Because Brian Epstein wasn't satisfied. He kept bringing me new groups, saying, George, the Liverpool scene now, it's all happening. I've got access to these people, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Billy J. Kramer, Cilla Black. I want you to record them all. You're great at recording. Let's keep them all to ourselves. And I said, Brian, there's only so many hours in a day. In the meantime, I'm aware that I want these records to be released in the States. And Capitol, whom we owned, would be very put downing about it. Well, of course, they're very good records, but they won't sell in America. And we say, well, we think they will. Yes, but you don't know the American market, and after all, it is our job, old chap. We should know what sells here, so sorry. No, we don't want this one. Try again later, maybe. And so we tried again, sent them second single. I mean, every single that came out, we offered it to them. And after 3 singles, I went to Len Wood, who was running a business here. I said, this is nonsense. If I can't get the record out in our own label in the States, give me the right to go and somebody else. And so Roland Rennie, I think, organised it. And he sold 1 record to VJ and another record to Swan. And still Capitol kept turning him down. And they turned down 3 records in a row. And the 4th one, by the time the 4th one was offered to them, they realised that something was happening because VJ and Swan had been making noises. The big success in England reached America. And it was a building up of a dam that had to break.
Did it come close to you selling the group to one of those labels, or did you manage to hold that back? I mean, if VJ didn't say, "Look, we want to sign the group,"
they did, of course, but I wasn't holding them back, but EMI were. They said, "No, we won't. We'll only release you on a single by single basis." So from that point of view, they saved it for Capitol.
Came that close.
And Capitol came that close, and Capitol eventually decided to put out "I Want to Hold Your Hand." Well, when they did that. Swan and VJ had already been plugging like the living daylights out. And it all happened, that's why there was such a big breaking of the dam when that happened, because there was so much pressure, it had to happen. And then Capitol, of course, claimed it as their success. And in fact, Alan Livingston kept me out of there. I was over there with the Beatles, and I wasn't allowed to attend any press function. And they took it as being their success. I hated the living daylight out of them all. It was terrible.
They didn't want you.
They didn't want me to be there. No.
No kidding.
So,
why not?
Because it took the guilt off their gingerbread.
Oh, sure.
These are our boys, fellas. And they couldn't say that if I was going around saying these are my boys, fellas. So I was kept out of it.
It's rather an inane question to ask, but was it the chemistry? Was it the songs? Was it the times? Was it a combination of all of it? What was it for this group of people?
It was a timing was right. There's no doubt about that. It was a time when people wanted something new and they wanted something a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more exciting, and which they got. The songs were fantastic. The songs were really good and what people needed. To begin with, they were kind of almost kit songs. They took the boys were very clever and they could see what sold and they could see the hooks that were needed and they assembled them very well. They learnt their craft very quickly. And dare I say, I think the records were well produced too. I think all those 3 things helped.
How did it work in the studio? Who was in charge? Who had the ideas? Was it
Well, to begin with, I was very much in charge because I was the kind of schoolmaster teaching them everything. And they had to do what I told them. And I kind of programmed things. They brought me a raw song and I say, well, this has got to last 2.5 to 3 minutes. You've just played me about 50 seconds of music. We've got to make something more of it. So I would structure it for them. I tell them, all right, it's got to be 2 choruses, but there's a second chorus, we can have a guitar solo in the beginning it, and then we'll have to have an introduction and an ending. And let me see, how are we going to make the introduction? We'll take this phrase out here. Can't Buy Me Love is an example of that. If you listen to the introduction, I took it off the thing, and because the original song started with the verse. So that was that kind of role to begin with. But then, of course, as the songs got more interesting and more complicated, and as the boys get to know the studios and got to more canny, because they were very canny boys, so they put more of their ideas into the studio too. And it became much more of a democratic team.
all of them?
All of them. There were 5 voices in the studio. If there were, during the first 3 years, if there was any one voice that had any more authority than the others, it was mine. But there were 5 equal voices, and everyone's voice was listened to. So that, generally speaking, the writer of the song was the person who had the original idea. If John had written a song, he'd sing it with Paul, standing up with a guitar, and I'd sit on a stool and listen to him, and we'd talk about how we're going to do it. And George might have an idea for the solo, or Ringo might have an idea for the rhythm of it, or whatever. And it was pooled. It was very much a democratic way of doing it.
Were you closer to anyone than the others?
Not really. Certainly not in those days. No. Gradually, as things changed, then they went into their little spheres, and they became much more. The rivalry between John and Paul became much more marked. So that they never were great cooperators. They never were great. They were never Rodgers and Hart. They never collaborated in the sense of sitting down to write a song together. They would have an idea. One would have an idea for a song and take to the other guy and say, "Look, I need a help here on this line. Can you give it to me?" And that was the way they collaborated. And generally speaking, their songs were pitched against each other, saying, well, you've written that, hey, listen to mine. So it was a competitive collaboration. And it was valuable nonetheless because, in fact, Paul misses it terribly now. He misses that spark of John being rude to him and saying, you can't write that, Paul. It's awful, you know. He needs that. And only John could really say that most effectively to him.
What was happening to George Martin? Reputation, income,
Well, at that time, nothing much except extremely hard work because, don't forget, I still had my roster of old artists. I still had my Ron Goodwins and my Matt Monroes and my jazz records to produce and Scottish country dance music. I was still running a label as well as producing all these records.
Did you make Here's to My Lady, Matt Monroe, that album?
Yeah.
One of the finest albums, and he just died a couple of years ago.
Thank you, that's right.
One of the finest records. Nina Never Knew.
That's right.
Oh, God, what a marvelous record.
Well, thank you. Matt was a dear friend of mine, but of course, when the Beatles came along, he was very much regarded as passé,
Sure.
naturally. And
But for you, did requests come in? Were there offers to become the king of the world? Or?
not in money terms. There was people wanted me to work for them. I mean, Shirley Bassey said, "This guy must be great. I want him to make records." So I took her on as well, and I made I Who Had Nothing. I made Goldfinger with her. So I did actually have a golden touch during that year. But I worked my backside off because, I don't know how much I produced in that year, but on that particular, this is 1963 I'm talking about, before the dam broke in 1964 in America. No, it was 1964, must have been that year.
Yes.
When I actually had, in England, out of 52 weeks in the year, I had the number one spot of a record that I'd made for 37 weeks. I was leapfrogging myself. Whenever my number one record was deposed, it was deposed by another number one record that I'd made.
And who were these? These were Billy Kramer and
Well, it was
Jerry.
the Beatles, Jerry and Pacemakers, Priscilla Black, Billy J. Kramer. And they all were phased, so they all took over. And that particular year will never be equalled again. And I don't want it to be either, because it nearly killed me. I was working every day, every evening, every weekend. And at the end of the year, I had my secretary got her bonus from EMI, and I didn't get mine. I couldn't understand why. And so I rang up and said, an accounting mistake. Oh, no, they said, now your salary has gone over £3,000 a year. You are in the management category, and you don't get a bonus. And I got nothing. I didn't have any royalty on the records, and I just worked my backside off for nothing.
Could you step away for a minute and realize what your reputation was becoming around the world, or were you just so busy that you couldn't even?
Not really. I would go to the States and I'd be with the boys, but Capitol always tried to keep me out of things.
Even later on.
Yeah, well, I was an embarrassment to them. And you see, it's difficult for you to understand because EMI were very sort of, they were very low key, and they didn't like having names of people on records, for example. So up to the Beatles time, I never had a production credit on anything I made. It became retrospective, but I fought for it. Before the Beatles came along, I was contemplating leaving EMI and starting what I did later do, going independent. But unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, in January 1962, when I was thinking of leaving, I signed a contract for another 3 years, which took me up to 65. And I regretted it when the Beatles came along because I was tired.
How aware were you of what other producers were earning and their reputation?
Well, they weren't in England.
In the States.
In the States they were. Well, I knew that everybody in the States earned more than they did in England. So that was. Len Wood used to go to the States and see how the boss of Capitol lived, and he would commiserate, but he just put it down to the fact he was English, not that he was. He didn't realise he could actually do the same thing. So it was we were taught to be humble, and we were very successful at it.
Was it an enormous? Did you feel the group, the boys, breaking up? Did you have all the indications that group was?
Well, when they did break up.
Yeah, when they did break up.
Yes, it was. I was amazed it lasted so long, Joe. It lasted 8 years. It was 1962 when we started, and earlier for them. I was 1962 when I started with them. And they eventually, the last record we made was 1970, was it? Something like that.
70, yes.
So that's 8 years, and it's a hell of a long time for poor people to live in each other's pockets. And I was amazed that they did last as long as they did. I thought it was all over during the Let It Be time, because that was the most uncomfortable time, when John and Paul and George were all fighting, and they hated each other's guts, and the women were fighting for them as well, and money came into it, and it was a messy scene. And I was unhappy about it. I was just a bystander. And that Let It Be album that we made, before it was remade, was as good as I could make within the strictures that John had allowed me, because John didn't like what he called his production crap. He liked it as they did. He liked a record to be as natural and honest as possible. So he wanted records to go out warts and all.
How did he felt about Sgt. Pepper?
Well, I guess he was proud of Sgt. Pepper, but he was tired of the production crap, as he put it. And after Let It Be, I thought that was curtains. I mean, we still liked each other personally, but from a professional point of view, he just wanted to do his rock and roll, the simple stuff, and get on with his life, doing his message for various people. And I was very surprised when one day Paul rang me up and said, will you come back and make another record with us? And I said, well, not like Let It Be. It doesn't. I said I felt emasculated by that. And he said, well, if we want to do a record again, we want to do a good record, will you produce it? I said, if you allow me to produce it like I produced it before, then fine, I will. He said, yes, we will. I promise you we will. And so we went back and we made Abbey Road. And Abbey Road was, and the boys were wonderful in that. And I think they knew it was the last record, because they all tried to make it good. Even John tried to settle his differences with Paul. And it was a good album.
Did the identification with the band help you later when you went off to do other things?
Well, once I knew I would make no more Beatle records, then I knew I was free. And I didn't then want to have any ongoing responsibility for anybody. For 8 years of my life, I'd had the responsibility of planning their recording career and worrying about it, and always worrying whether my next number one I make with them was going to be a number one, and worrying whether the next album was going to have a good cover or not. All these kind of things. It was part of my life, and I thought to myself, well, you've had that now. And I had lots of offers from people to produce record. So I said, well, let me have a few one-night stands instead of being married. So I would say, okay, I'll make one album with you, on the understanding that if it works out well, we might do another one. If it doesn't, no harm lost, no blood lost. And that's what we did.
Who were some of the first ones that you...
Well, oddly enough, one of the first ones I did was a group that I went on to make 7 albums with. And that was America. Because they came along to me and they were very polite. They'd already had their big success, and they'd gone through their arrogant bit, and they come down the other side of it. And they played me some of the songs they had, and I liked them. And we did a lot of pre-planning, but we made it in their studios here in London, and we put on a schedule of recording it, and we recorded it and mixed it and finalised it in 17 days, including orchestrations and everything. And it was very, very comfortable and very nice to work with them. They were wonderful guys to work with.
I signed it.
And they were so sweet. And at the end of it, when we were listening to the playbacks, I said, fellas, this has been one of the happiest recordings I've ever made. It's just a pity it won't sell. And they looked at me and said, why? What's wrong? I said, well, it can't do, can it? It's been too good. Been too happy. I mean, it's a great record, but no one's going to listen to it because we've had no bad vibes. Who's going to buy a record with no bad vibes? I was being slightly cynical, but at the same time, there was a lot of truth I felt in it. I thought, well, it's been a very nice experience, and I don't think I'll be recording them again. But of course, it was a big record, Holiday. Was it Holiday? No, it wasn't. Yes, it was Holiday.
Is that the one with Ventura Highway?
Yeah, it was. There were a couple of hits, single hits of it, and we made quite a few hits with them.
And then you proceeded to. Was it your aim just to produce records here and there, or were you looking to make some big production company?
Well, I'd already left EMI. I'd left EMI in '65 and started Air. And my partners were doing their things. Peter Sullivan was doing Tom Jones, and John Burgess here was doing Manfred Mann and Adam Faith and people like that. And we had quite a nice little outfit going. And in 1969, of course, I built Air Studios in here.
Oh, here.
1969, this was. We opened our studios in London. And that, I wanted to build a studio that was better than EMI, which I thought we could do, and which we did. And that was a labour of love, and I was very much involved in that. And I was the sort of prime mover there, and that was also a worrying time, but fun to do. And I like doing lots of different things, and I still made the odd record when I felt like it, And I did 3 albums with Stan Getz, but being such a lousy businessman, I never asked for any royalties. Did you know that? In the MGM days, I made Dynasty with him, and I forget the names of the other 2. Yeah.
I think one of those is out on a CD now, as a matter of fact.
They're probably Dynasty's on CD, I think, but I probably don't get a credit. But you ask Stan who produced those records.
I'm going to see him again. I'm going to lecture. He teaches up at Stanford, and I'm going to lecture to his class.
And he was going through. When I first met Stan, he had a very great problem, and he was playing very badly, and we nursed him. We nursed him through it, and he started playing good again.
He's dry now.
Yeah.
Totally dry.
Yeah.
For the last 2 years.
That's right.
Told me just are there some other producers along the way that you've thought were really terrific?
Of course, and there still are too.
Who are some of them that you've admired?
Well, I mean, some of my old friends, and they're still in there rooting. I better not say the ones I don't admire, had I? But in your country, Phil Ramone, Quincy, of course. There's a young old guy called Stuart Levine who's very good.
Oh, sure.
There's some great characters, and of course the older guys. Arif Mardin is terrific. Tom Dowd was terrific, but he came up the engineering way. And then the guys who don't really produce anymore, people like Ahmet, who had their finger on what was needed, which was the key of a producer, really. A producer's got to be able to know what's needed in the studio before he tries to get it. A lot of kids go in there today and try to get something which they don't know what's needed in the first instance. I think it's no good having the skill without having the taste.
Is there any artist that you wish you had produced, somebody, even today?
I wish that, without the headaches,
yes.
Yeah. Because, right now, I've always said I'd love to make a record with Streisand, but I never would, because I wouldn't be worth it. I don't think I could take the pain that goes with it. I'd love to have done Sinatra in the old days, but I don't think I'd want to do him now. So you'll have to rephrase that delicately.
No, that's okay. Any kind of music that you thought you could take a shot at? Could you ever make an R&B record or a country record?
Not really, because I'm not really good. I only like doing things I think I'm good at. I think one of the regrets I have is that we didn't progress the music we were developing in the Beatle days. I think we were going somewhere. I think the Pepper was a kind of landmark. And I think that Let It Be, even though it was a kind of abortive record, led somewhere. And Abbey Road certainly led somewhere. And I think we were establishing a style of music which was different from anything that had gone before, and I think was progressing towards something that was really brilliant. But it didn't. It ended there.
And were you surprised that the parts were never equivalent to the whole? That none of them solo ever made the kind of record that people talk about? They sold records, but...
nothing that any one of them has done individually has been anything like as good as what they did as a team.
Do they know that?
I think they do.
Yeah.
I think they do. I've never actually asked any one of them if if they think that. I think they probably do. Certainly nothing I've done has ever been as good as what I did with them, and I think that we were a combination that was great. But I wasn't thinking particularly of that. I was thinking of other people continuing.
People taking it from there.
I thought of the development of music going in that direction.
Anybody close?
But nobody did. They were imitators and things, but all too soon there was a revulsion for it. There was a bit like John kicking over the traces and four-letter words coming out, and punk rock established its ugly head. And that was the kind of counterculture. And it became smart to be, to me, sort of primitive and aggressive. And so long as the aggression came out in music, that's all that mattered.
It's speculative, of course, and again, another funny question, but had they regrouped in 1978, 79, could it have happened again, or do you do it one time?
I don't know. I think the timing was crucial.
Yes.
And I think right now the record scene is so different because technology has changed it as well, and people's lifestyles have changed. In the 1960s, television wasn't the It didn't have the grip on the human mind that it has now. You know, that square box with a screen dominates people's lives, both in your country and mine. And we didn't have that domination in the 60s. And now you can only sell a record by selling it through the TV. And I think if we'd had that in Beatle days, I don't think we would have made the kind of records we made, because the records we made needed oral imagination in order to get enjoyment from them. Nowadays, that is supplied with visual imagination. People look at pictures.
To do something.
Right. Penny Lane gives you an oral picture. We were painting pictures and sound. Nowadays, you don't do that because you're painting pictures and vision as well, and the sound doesn't carry all the message, which I think is a shame from a sound point of view.
If there is a period of time, 6 months to a year, something like that, that you could put in a bottle and put up on a shelf, and in your dotage 25 years from now, pull down and look at it and say that was the best, would it have been that year in '64 when you were making all those records, or some other time?
No, I think that year was certainly the busiest and most frenetic and enjoyable year. But I don't think it was the vintage year. I think the vintage years came after that. I think the vintage years were between. I can't think of it in terms of years so much as in terms of issues. I think the vintage years were between Rubber Soul or even Revolution. Not Revolution. I mean what was the Revolver. Between Revolver and Abbey Road. I think those were the vintage years.
And they were the best for you? You felt you were at the top of your game?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have any physical rewards. I was still poor and so on, but it was the apotheosis of my career, undoubtedly, because I haven't produced records that have been absolutely as great as that since. I produced most satisfying records, records which I'm very proud of, that a lot of people haven't heard. I mentioned the Apocalypse of my Vishnu. I think it's one of the best records I've made. I think that one of the best records I made was a record with the Winter Consort called Icarus, but they won't tell us, so the public don't know about them. But for me, they were pretty good. But certainly, from a kind of peak, I guess I did peak at that time.
Thank you.